This is one of those topics that you don't really make YouTube videos about, because the topic is so sensitive that whatever you say on the topic, it's sure to invite controversy. But tonight, I hope to deconstruct a few terms, and perhaps give you an idea about what the word concentration camp really means. And so, starting out today's video, I want you to try to think in as abstract terms as possible. What is a concentration camp? In 2017, Donald Trump's administration did a bit of a policy change, which has gotten a lot of people very upset. Currently, people who are crossing the southern American border are doing so at risk of being detained, including those who are asking for asylum. Doing so also sometimes strips children away from their families, as children and adults cannot be interned or detained in the same way or facility. And because of this, there's been a bit of a media uproar. However, if you are a Trump supporter, or if you support the detention camps, I want you to listen. I do not believe that Donald Trump is actually Hitler. Nor do I believe that Donald Trump is running death camps. But some people, including important political figures, have said that what is happening on the southern border is actually concentration camps.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border. And that is exactly what they are. They are concentration camps. The fact that concentration camps are now an institutionalized practice in the home of the free is extraordinarily disturbing.
And so I make this video for the people who might see this and think that this disrespects victims of actual concentration camps, that it devalues the term concentration camp. And to do so, we need to talk about what the term concentration camp actually means. And to do that, I'm going to mention some topics in the meanwhile. I am going to talk a little bit about Nazis. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Holocaust. But I'm going to try to keep this discussion as much in the abstract that is possible, if you will allow me. And so before I start in earnest, some background is needed. Many reports have come out that the conditions in the detention camps are abysmal, are horrific. And so the real question is, can this be compared to concentration camps? Is that comparison valid? And I want you to think about that question. I won't be able to answer it, but the question that we're most concerned with is this. What is a concentration camp? First things first, the word concentration camp. The first thing you might think of are the death camps of the Holocaust, and you're definitely not wrong for thinking that. But it is an incomplete picture. The word concentration in concentration camps comes from the purpose of the camps, to gather and intern groups of people belonging to a specific group, to concentrate them, usually in horrifying conditions. And camp, well, that's probably the least interesting part of the word. The phrase concentration camp is actually a euphemism coined in the early 1900s, originally called reconcentration camp. And during those days, the word concentration camp had connotations of detention center, relocation camp. It did not have the incredibly negative connotation until the Holocaust, which is obviously understandable. But this is not the same thing as an extermination camp, which is a camp built for the specific purpose of mass murder. Instead, concentration camps could fill a variety of roles, from forced labor to detention to temporary holding of prisoners. And while people did and do die at these facilities too, that is not the explicit purpose. Most scholars therefore try to keep a distinguishing line between the term concentration camp and extermination camp. However, there are some who argue that extermination camps are merely a category of concentration camps. But for this video specifically, I wanted to keep the terms separated. This distinction, however, is incredibly important, because during this discussion, there are some people who will say that
the United States is running concentration camps on our southern border.
And the response to that will sometimes be,
I'm not saying that what's going on at the border with family separation isn't horrific, it is. Yeah. But I do think that there is a big difference between being rounded up by Nazis for the intention of being exterminated is a huge difference. And I will say, you have the Auschwitz Museum coming out and condemning this. You have the Jewish Community Relations Council calling this deeply disturbed by the language and urge her to refrain from making the comparison. I too agree that you cannot compare anything to the Holocaust. 6 million plus people were exterminated. I understand everyone's emotion.
But those statements can be true at the same time. They are not mutually exclusive. And so we return to the question, what is a concentration camp? Now, the easy answer to that question is the literal description, which I've just described. But it's very generic. It doesn't quite cover the bases that we want it to cover. Because, well, gathering a specific group of people in a concentration in poor conditions, that can also incorporate prisons or refugee centers. Simply going by the literal description, then the comparison is apt. That is what Trump is doing, albeit in a lesser scale than Nazi Germany. However, less bad than the Nazis is a really low bar to cover. However, we all pretty much accept that there is more to it than that. There are connotations, there are other historical implications that the camps in America might not cover, and therefore they shouldn't be called concentration camps. And this is the argument of many other people who argue against calling them concentration camps. So let's ground this definition in something. Let's talk about arguably the first concentration camp that I think everyone can agree definitely was a concentration camp. Dachau. So Dachau was opened in 1933, right after Adolf Hitler had solidified power in Germany. It was built from an old munitions factory and had recently been converted to hold around 5,000 prisoners. The reason why it opened, however, is incredibly important, because there's an assumption among many people that the concept of a prison and the concept of a concentration camp are inherently different from each other. And that's not really the historical case. A part of why this concentration camp was opened was to deal with political opponents, communists, socialists, and anarchists, while the Nazis were still solidifying their power. They did this with the justification that these groups were terrorists, that they were gang members, that they were thugs, that they were somehow plotting against Germany itself. In the eyes of the Nazis, they were terrorists who were imminently going to destroy Germany. And so, Dachau was opened. And it wasn't some secret, shameful Nazi back alley dealing. It was in the news. On Wednesday, the first concentration camp is to be opened in Dachau, with an accommodation for 5,000 people. All communists and, where necessary, Reichsbanner and social democratic functionaries who endanger state security are to be concentrated here, as, in the long run, it is not possible to keep individual functionaries in the state prisons without overburdening these prisons. Because the technical definition of concentration camp might sometimes also include prisons and more mainstream internment facilities, everyone kind of agrees that the term concentration camp is more extreme, that there is something about concentration camps that makes them inherently different from prisons and other forms of internment. Two of the features often cited are scale and severity, the idea that concentration camps are larger in scale and harsher in punishment. And because of that, I have created for this video, and for this video specifically, a type of spectrum. On one end, there are no prisons at all. There are no concentration camps, there are no prisons, there is no form of internment whatsoever. And what you imagine as an alternative to that, that's up to you. But the point is, no one is being forcibly removed from freedom, so to say. On the other end of that spectrum is forced death, the total removal of freedom. Even if that system changes in the future, you can't be saved from death. Even in the next worst option, which I assume to be forced to be dying, you can still be saved. Every single country on Earth operates on this spectrum when it comes to the judicial system, the jail system, the prison system, etc. And the idea is that on one extreme on this spectrum, that's where the concentration camps are. That's where the line is drawn. Some cases are just too spectacular. But that's not really true. That's because from the point of an individual prisoner, the most extreme you can go is death. And there are many countries who have the death penalty that we wouldn't really say are running concentration camps. And so the other factor plays in. Scale. The idea is that somewhere there's a line where if you do too much harsh punishments to too many people, that's when it starts getting into concentration camp territory. So let's add another dimension to the spectrum. On the high end, everyone is interned. Everyone is punished by whatever punishment system that you have. And again, every single country on Earth operates somewhere along this line. On the low end of this axis, almost no one is punished by the severity in the system. And on the high end, almost everyone is. But where exactly do you draw the line between a system of concentration camps and a normal prison system? For an individual prisoner who dies in poor conditions, that line doesn't really matter that much. And beyond that, from the perspective of the people interned in a specific camp, does it really matter what the scale and severity is outside of that camp? And remember, Dachau started with only 5,000 prisoners. ICE is currently holding over 50,000. Moreover, the early camps were built to supplement the already existing state prisons, which were already filling the same function as concentration camps. But when we think of concentration camps, we don't think of prisons, even if they, in Nazi Germany, fulfilled exactly the same function early on. But there is one more factor that is sometimes used to reject concentration camps, but justify prisons. Guilt. Internment is different from imprisonment. Internment is the idea of imprisoning someone without charge or without a fair trial, usually under poor conditions. This difference is what distinguishes real prisoners from innocent prisoners. When people say that history is written by the victor, this is an important point, because who gets to decide who is charged fairly? Who gets to decide who has a fair trial? Beyond that, even if we accept that some people shouldn't be charged with crimes, who gets to decide what poor conditions are? Probably the most common argument as to why the camps on the southern border aren't concentration camps is this: the people who cross the border are criminals. They have committed a crime, and it's their fault for committing the crime, and therefore it can't be a concentration camp, because real victims of concentration camps are innocent. And that's true from our point of view. History is written by the victor, and it wasn't the Nazis who won the war, and so they didn't get to decide who was treated fairly and who was interned fairly. We got to do that. We, the non-Nazi side, got to say that the people who were victims of Nazi concentration camps were innocent, or at least some of them. You could say that, well, we have courts. We have learned from the mistakes of the past, and we have fair courts now. But who gets to decide that the courts are fair? Take a notable example. Children in immigration courts. Sometimes young as 3 years old, representing themselves in court regarding removal proceedings. Deportations. And you would think something that outrageous wouldn't be allowed in most courts. However, in immigration court, you are not entitled to legal representation. And that's pretty unique. Beyond that, in the normal court system of America, most cases don't go to trial, instead relying on plea bargains and minimum sentencing issues. Are these courts fair? If they're not, can we really say that the people who are imprisoned or interned under that system have had a fair trial? We get to say that it is a fair trial. But the Nazis had courts too. Had the Nazis won, they would almost surely say that their courts were fair too. There is a concept sometimes used in history called a sham court, which is a legal system that doesn't fairly practice its laws for the political goals of the people in power. A US immigration court, where only one side has the right to legal representation, could definitely be categorized as one. Now, does it compare to Nazi courts? Not really. Obviously not. But we're not talking about a direct equivalence. We're not saying that the camps on the southern border are Nazi concentration camps. We're saying that they're concentration camps. That's not the same thing. I'm just saying that in a court system that is heavily flawed, that often discriminates, that often has issues, structural issues, maybe the people who are subject to those courts aren't subject to a fair trial. And so can we really say that the people who are interned in the ICE camps are guilty? That's not to mention the case of asylum seekers who are being interned. Seeking asylum is not a crime, it's a human right. To intern people who are seeking asylum is at best a bit shady and at worst flagrant violations of human rights. Can someone who is interned for seeking asylum really have fair legal representation? Actually, while I was editing this, a court ruled that asylum seekers cannot be interned indefinitely. But they are still interned. But there is a reason the argument of legality doesn't always work. There's an idea then that because the concentration camps in Germany held innocent people, that this was a crime. And it was a crime against humanity, certainly. But not in Germany. From the laws that existed in the context and at the time, the concentration camps, the mass murder, and the Holocaust was all entirely legal. The argument of legality doesn't hold up. Even if we assume that every single person interned in detention facilities is objectively legally guilty, we decide what is legal and what isn't. There is no objective law. There is no objective rule. The law is created by people. And if we say that something inhuman is legal, it doesn't really change anything. The story that surrounds the idea of concentration camp is deeply tied with the history of the Second World War. That is where most people hear about the concept of concentration camp, and that is their first anchor point into what the term means. History telling relies on telling a narrative, and the view of the Second World War from much of the Western world is a narrative of good versus evil. And you can most certainly argue that that is what happened. But the truth is complicated. This type of storytelling often raises Nazis to a form of mythical demon. Some conceptual evil that doesn't really exist in real life in everyday scenarios. And the same things happen with concentration camps, even when we fully accept that they happen, because they are lifted to this absurd evil. And it is, but they are lifted to a form of evil that we can connect to. It allows us to think of the Second World War and the genocides perpetrated during the war as being mythical, almost unreal. But the truth is that they are real, and also more common than you think. The concept of a concentration camp isn't new. It existed long before the Second World War and will exist long after. And it's not something that just Nazis can do while doing literally the worst genocide the human race has ever seen. Because the Nazis, the guards, the mass murderers, and the planners of the Holocaust were all human. They were all people. Evil people, I grant you, but they were all people. Often we only pay attention to concentration camps when they are hard to ignore, and that's a hard truth too. Because the narrative of concentration camps is so deeply tied to the idea of the Second World War, there's also an idea that the Allies helped free Europe from tyranny. But that's not what happened. You could definitely argue that it was a result of what happened, but it was not the reason why it happened. Again, concentration camps were in the news in 1933. The Nuremberg laws that legalized and codified racial discrimination, they happened in 1935. The war broke out in 1939. If the Allies really wanted to rid Europe of terror, they had plenty of opportunity to. But they didn't. Again, I mention this not to downplay anything. I mention it because this narrative alienates the concept of concentration camps, genocide, mass murder, mass internment, and fascism to this abstract. And this is important because by doing this, by alienating these concepts so much, we dismiss the idea that it could happen here. It allows us to create a narrative, even among the most evil of us, that no matter how evil I am, no matter how evil the government is, no matter how bad the military system works, no matter how bad the prison system is, it can't be as bad as that. Nothing can be as bad as fascism. Nothing can be as bad as the Nazi death camps. And so anything that is even remotely connected to it kind of gets a free pass. Because it's not literally that. It's not actually that thing. As I mentioned earlier, a common response is that, well, America isn't running death camps. America isn't killing millions of people. That's not happening currently in camps. But should we really have to wait until it gets that far? Remember, Dachau, one of the worst concentration camps, but also the first, opened with 5,000 prisoners and used forced labor in poor conditions. That was it in 1933. It got worse. And that's why I said it in the beginning, I don't believe that Donald Trump is literally Hitler. I don't believe that even if America is running concentration camps, they are Nazi concentration camps. That's not happening. But no one is saying that. What people are saying is there are features happening that are reminiscent of bad things to come. Maybe we should act now before it gets worse. Even if Donald Trump wanted to be Hitler, even if Donald Trump wanted to reshape America into be Nazi Germany with the uniforms and the aesthetic and the swastikas, he couldn't do that. Simply because the circumstances are different. And because history doesn't work that way. History is cyclical, isn't literal. So a large part of this is how do we define words? How do words work? I feel like a lot of online arguments essentially boil down to that. How do we just define terms? And the word of today is obviously concentration camp. What is a concentration camp? In history, using a kind of checklist approach, trying to dot off this thing has that and that and that and that and that, and if it meets the criteria for a word, it becomes that word. History doesn't work like that, and also words don't really work like that either. The better question to ask is, What purpose does this concept fill? For what reason does this concept exist? And the thing is, this actually has nothing to do with Donald Trump. Donald Trump was in the news a lot, sure, but he's not really the cause of this. Because, well, Obama had similar issues. And so did Bush. So did a lot of presidents in America. Hell, any nation with deep flaws in the judicial system and prisons with poor conditions could probably technically fall under the umbrella of having concentration camps. And one could say that the American prison system, with its hundreds of thousands of prisoners and flawed judicial system that frequently discriminates and oftentimes does not go to trial, with poor legal representation for common people, you could say that the entire American prison system is a form of concentration camp. You could say that. You could. Okay, well, let's say that I'm wrong. Let's say this entire video is wrong. Let's say that the camps run by ICE on the southern border in poor conditions where they intern people without fair representation for arbitrary reasons are just objectively not concentration camps for whatever reason. They have an essence of not concentration camp-y. What do you call those camps? Say you call them detention camps. Okay, fine, whatever. They are detention facilities. Is that okay now, then? Because the issue isn't the word. The issue has never been the word concentration camp. And that's why it kind of hurts me to talk about it in this way in this video, because the word is unimportant. The word is a word. What matters is the conditions of the people interned. Do they have legal representation? Do they have livable conditions? Do they have human rights respected? If they don't, you should work on that. It doesn't matter if you call it a concentration camp or not. You can call it a concentration camp light if that makes you feel better. The reason I think why people even talk about the word is about the word as a concept. And that's why I've talked about it as a concept here. But the concept is abstract and unimportant. Think instead of the conditions for an individual prisoner. How would they define it? They might not define it as a concentration camp, and that's fine, but if they die in an ICE facility, does it really matter at that point? Isn't that kind of already bad enough no matter what you call it? So if you don't want to call it concentration camps, okay, fine, then don't. But historically, they fulfill the same purpose, they exist for the same purpose, they have similar conditions, and they're really bad no matter what you call it. The word does not matter. The conditions in the camps do. And if you care more about the word than about the actual material conditions for the people who are suffering under them, then I don't know how to convince you. Because at that point you care more about words than morals. There's nothing I can do to convince anyone who believes that. I would like to thank all my patrons for helping me make sure that I can make this video. I feel like it's the least I can do, considering the circumstances. I want to give special thanks to Aini Salminen, Amelia Fletcher, Argri Konu, Charlotte van Peteren, Christopher Steinmuller, Xbox, Emil Rutkowski, Emma Not Goldman, Fox Kant, Garrett Gutierrez, Jane Lusby, Jörgen Danielsen, Katarzyna JJ, Kim, Kitchens, LPQ Silver, Linus 2.0, Learan Sagan, Marcin Servin, Nicholas Trevino, Phobos 2390, Rosie, Ryan Kolak, Sula Emanuel, Vinder, William Pietri, and Rex.